Welcome to the Sound Advice podcast. We are Citizens Advice North East Derbyshire. We focus on providing advice for people within the North East Derbyshire and Bolsover district and want to do just that with our podcast. Enjoy!
Hi, I'm Sian. I'm a university student studying politics in Manchester, but I've been volunteering with Citizens Advice for around 6 months now. I've got involved with this podcast because we're aiming at specifically at younger people like myself, and I'm hoping I'll learn a lot too, as we're hopefully going to be covering a lot of topics that are important to people my age and giving some good advice. So this week we're talking about furlough and the furlough scheme, and I've gathered up some questions from people my age to ask Ben, who is more of an expert on these things.
I wouldn't go so far as expert, but I'll give it a go. So if it's useful, first of all, a bit of background. The furlough scheme started when we went into the first lockdown in March. The idea of it was to allow employers to reduce the financial burden they'd got with having to close workplaces and lay people off, and also to ensure that staff members and members of the public had some income protection. So the government have guaranteed that they would cover 80% of employee wage costs. It does mean in a large number of cases where employers can't top that up to 100%, employees take a 20% hit, but that is a lot better than the potential redundancy situations that many people might have found themselves in. Initially, the furlough scheme meant that people could do no work whatsoever for an employer and still receive the furlough. But in June, July sort of time, they introduced the flexible furlough system, so employers could reintroduce some part-time working if they were able to reopen and still claim some money for the hours that the employees weren't able to work. So you could be in the situation where you work 2 or 3 days a week because that's the work is available, and the rest of the week the employer could claim the 80% top up from the furlough scheme. It was due to end as a scheme in October, on the 31st of October, but as everybody knows now, we're in a second lockdown, and the government agreed to extend the furlough initially during the period of the lockdown until December, but they've announced that the furlough scheme will last until March, so it will have been running a whole year by the time we get there. It's important that employees realise that they're not contractually obliged to accept a reduction in wages. So although an employer might want to put employees on the furlough scheme, if they're contracted to, say, 30 hours, they're entitled to be paid for those 30 hours. They have to agree to a reduction to 80% in writing. So if your employer has asked you to be furloughed, consider your options first, consider the impact on your own financial situation, but on the flip side, consider what the options are for your employer, because the likelihood is that the employer needs to make these cost savings. So if you're not agreeing to have a reduction, the alternative for your employer might be to look at redundancy. So in a lot of cases, it's weighing up what your options are. If you take the hit to your wages, or if you take the risk and say, no, I can't afford that, where do you go from there? In a lot of cases, there might be benefit entitlement for you to support with a shortfall in income, but that's something that your local Citizens Advice is able to check up for you. So I'd encourage anybody to seek advice if they're in any doubt whatsoever. Get advice and find out what your entitlements are and what your employment rights are. So that's a bit of background for you.
That's really interesting, because I already didn't know that you weren't actually contracted to accept the furlough and that you then can make the choice. But then obviously the other choice might be redundancy. But I really didn't know that you actually had a choice in accepting the whole thing.
Absolutely. It's because it is a change to your employment terms of conditions. Yeah. So you do have to agree it in writing. So always check what you're being offered first.
Yeah. So one thing that came up when I was talking to my friends about this a lot was people on 0 hours contracts. So personally, I was last summer on a 0 hours contract through an agency doing bar work. So but I hadn't worked for them for over 6 months when coronavirus lockdown came in. So I was basically expecting not to have any contact from them or anything in terms of furlough pay. But then some of my friends were in slightly different situations, where one friend who had been working like part-time at a theme park in all of like her school holidays and then university holidays was on a 0 hours contract, but she'd worked there for a very, very long time and she didn't receive any furlough pay at all. It's then looking like, obviously we've now gone back into lockdown as well, so it's looking like the theme park is unlikely to reopen again for her to work there over Christmas. So she's now looking at she'll lose the income that she usually gets over that period to support herself when she's studying. So something that she wanted to ask was what support there is for people on 0 hours contracts, because it seems, well, she found it quite unclear because obviously she's had no money at all from her work, whereas some people who were also on 0 hours contracts have had money. So she wanted to ask about that, and also maybe, I'm not sure if you actually know the answer to this, but she wondered why it is that people on 0 hours contracts were left out of the official furlough scheme when they make up such a big percentage of the UK workforce.
They're not. People on 0 hours contracts are entitled to receive furlough pay. So I don't know whether this is something that the employer has told your friend, but she needs to definitely check with the employer, because people on 0 hours contracts are entitled to receive it. It's complicated in the method of calculating it. And I should have pointed out before that to be entitled, you have to have been on your employer's payroll at the beginning of March. So you have to have been receiving pay within the tax year 2019-20. It sounds from what you said that the friend has been in a contract of employment with them. So it doesn't sound to me as though there's been a break in employment. It's the same contract, but she just picks up the hours when she's able to and when they're available.
Yeah, that's correct. So that's really, again, really surprised me what you've just said, because she really thought that she wasn't entitled to anything at all. And she's basically been told that by her employer. And then it's also been very unclear whether she will just be made redundant completely from the employer as well. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, so if she was on their payroll in 2019-20,
Yes,
she can ask them to put her on the furlough scheme. The way they calculate it for people who have got variable pay is that they would look at the same period in the previous year. So for example, if she works during holidays, so she worked July, August, obviously she can't compare what she had in June, July because there was no income, but the employer should be looking at either the same period for the previous year and how much she would have earned in July, August 2019, or taking the average wages for the whole 2019-20 tax year, and whichever amount is higher is what they use to claim back from the furlough scheme. So if you earned £100 a week in August 2019, 80% of that is £80, so that's what you should be entitled to on furlough this year. There's no obligation for employers to put employees on the furlough scheme if they say that the work is available. But if they've closed and there's no work available, then it's something that your friend needs to challenge with her employer. It's not going to cost them because they claim the money back from the government. So I think it really is something that they need to check up on and ask for payment of, because if they're on the payroll, there's a good chance that they should be able to claim something back.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. I'll definitely let her know about that, because she really had no idea about that at all.
It's definitely worth checking.
Yeah, I think that definitely shows as well. I think from what a lot of people my age have said, it just seems they found it quite unclear, the guidance on furlough. And of course it is going to be unclear to some extent, because obviously it keeps changing. Obviously we now had the furlough renewed until March again.
Yeah.
Quite a similar question again from another friend who was also on a 0 hours contract, but they were furloughed, and then their place of work, because it was like a music venue and restaurant type place, did reopen in September and October, but it was on a lot more limited hours than it once was, obviously because the music venue bit of it couldn't open. So they were working a lot less, and yeah, it was just on a lot reduced capacity. So then obviously now we've gone back into lockdown and this venue has closed again. He said his furlough pay he's now receiving is based on the hours that he worked in September and October, which is a lot less than he really worked in January, February and March. So he thinks his furlough pay for this month should be based on his work between January and March, because that was in normal times, but it's not been based on that. So again, he's seen a loss of income in his furlough pay.
And again, it's the same situation as the first one. They should be calculating based on either the same period for the previous year or an average of what was earned in the 2019 tax year, whichever amount is higher. So if the average for 2019-20 is higher than the same period last year, then that's what the calculation's based on. If the same period last year is more than the overall average, it's based on that figure. So yeah, it sounds like there's an incorrect calculation going on there, which you need to challenge with the employer.
Yeah.
They might have made an honest mistake. It is easily done. Like you say, it's a changing situation. It's a difficult to understand situation. Employers aren't perfect, but it might mean that you just need approaching and asking them to correct any incorrect calculation. If they're unwilling to, your friend can put a grievance in. It can challenge the issue with HMRC if he thinks the employer is abusing the system, but it's worth following up first of all and seeing what their response is before he takes it any further. But certainly, if he feels he's not getting anywhere, get some advice from his local citizens advice or ACAS.
Yeah, that makes sense. And now a bit more of a general question, but I think this applies to a lot of people, or probably as well. Someone asked what to do if there are repeated delays in your furlough pay coming through from a part-time job, especially when you haven't actually been into your workplace for a while, so you don't have that direct contact to ask the employer anymore.
So although you're on furlough, it's still a contractual obligation that you are paid. And the understanding is that you are paid the normal day that you get paid each week or month, however you get paid. You have to be a bit flexible with employers because they are waiting for the money to come from HMRC. So what I would say in the first instance is to ask your employer, have you had this money yet? Usually it takes 6 working days for HMRC to process the request for the funding and then processing it and getting it to the employer. But if this is happening regularly, it suggests that there are problems with the way the employers are actually putting the requests in. So I would say to them, put a grievance in if your employer is not giving you any information. If it's becoming irregular regularly, and ask your employer why that is. If they can't give you any sort of satisfactory answer, or if you think that they've got the money and they're just not paying it out, put a grievance in, and also again consider reporting the issue to HMRC. If you're not getting that sorted out, it needs to be looked at, because people have got outgoings to pay, they've got rent to pay, and it's not fair to mess people about like that.
So that leads on to a similar question from another friend. This is quite a specific and complicated one, so I'm not sure if it would really apply to everybody, but I'm sure some other people have been in similar situations to this. So my friend was working full-time at a non-essential shop prior to the initial lockdown, and then obviously we went into the national lockdown, and she believed she wasn't being paid enough in furlough by her employer. And then, so that was the first problem. And then when the shop opened again in June, she then was able to find another job. So worked there for the remainder of June, handed in her notice. That was all fine, left correctly. But she has now found a new job. And she wondered if there was anything she could do, as she missed hundreds of pounds in furlough payment. Obviously now no longer works for the business. So she's not sure if she can ever get that money that she was owed or not.
Okay, first issue is if you are a fixed employee, if you're getting a fixed rate of pay for doing full-time work, it's slightly different calculating that in that it's looked at the last payment period in the financial year 2019-20, because your wages will be the same unless you get paid any overtime. So if you're working full-time and you worked normally up until the furlough system started in March, the last pay period that's looked at is the one that ended on or before the 19th of March 2020. So the way your friend, how you describe their situation, the amount that she received should have been calculated based on the pay period that she got before the 19th of March. So if that was a normal full rate, it should be 80% of that. So she first needs to check that that is 80% of it. If she's still not happy with the way that it was calculated, now she's left, it's been 3 months she's left, so she can't take the issue to a tribunal, but she can write to the employer asking for payment, because it's effectively a breach of contract if she wasn't paid correctly. So she'd need to put a letter to the employer, previous employer, and say to them, this is why I think you paid me incorrectly. This is the amount that I think is owed to me. And if you refuse, I will take further action in the county court, the small claims court, to pursue this money because you owed it contractually. You failed to pay me. It's a breach of contract.
Yeah. Okay. So in that situation, I was just wondering, how often is it that these things do get taken to like the county court? And then from that point, how often are they successful?
Quite often we look at, it's called an unauthorised deduction of wages. If you've left your employer, you've got 2 ways of dealing with it. You can go to the county court to claim it as a breach of contract issue, or you could go for a tribunal, but you have to have started a tribunal process within 3 months, less a day, of when you ended your employment. So that would have taken her, if she left in June, up to September, October sort of time. So she's out of time for that. You can still challenge an employer if you still work with them, but you would be expected to raise a grievance first and let the employer try and deal with it. So it might be a mistake. They might come back with an opportunity to challenge it. But really, if you can show that that's what your wages were, if you get your calculation right, there aren't many grounds for the employer to say, actually, it was right for me not to pay you this. So the grounds for making a deduction for an employer would be that you've agreed in writing that they can take that deduction, that your contract gives you that entitlement to take the deduction, or there's been some verbal change to your contract. If none of those apply, then there's no right for the employer to take that deduction. They've not really got any grounds to defend it, and they should pay it up, and there wouldn't be much dispute about that. It might just need a letter sent in to them in the first place to make them realise that the consequences would be court action to recover the money.
Okay, right, I've learned so much from those. Like, there was a lot of stuff I didn't know, especially about the 0 hours stuff. As a general point, where would be, like, young people, our first port of call if we were really having a problem with our employer and furlough. Any questions that we had, where would we go to?
I would say always try and talk to your employer first of all to see if you can resolve things informally.
Yeah.
The Citizens Advice website has got a load of information. If you want just some background to help you before you get there, you can get in touch with Citizens Advice over the phone or internet. You can get in touch with ACAS if you're not happy with the things that happen, if you need some guidance. They're all useful resources, and your local law centre quite often will give you employment law advice as well. And I'd always encourage people to join a trade union if they're not already in one. You'll always get some support from your union rep, and they've got a wealth of resources as well. If you're in employment and you're not sure of anything, talk to your employer, because quite often you might be able to find an informal resolution to it. Also need that backup as well, and knowing that you have got rights and how to enforce it. So approach us. We are approachable. Come and talk, get some advice, and it's better to know what your rights are than leaving it too late.
Okay, brilliant. So that's all of the questions I've got. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add about furlough on top of that, because obviously that was just a few things my friends had raised. But
It was, but they were quite varied questions that they'd got. I think what we've got out of that, I think it's important that you always check your employment contract. You always check any agreement that you're being asked to sign to change that. And if you're not sure at all, as I said, get advice about it, ask around, get in touch with your local Citizen Advice, your union rep, anybody, just talk. Don't think you're obliged to do anything until you've thought it through and weighed up the pros and cons. Depending on your circumstances, you might be entitled, as we said, to get some extra support through the benefits system. If you're in the situation where you're a student full-time, that's limited because you're a student and you get the support from your tuition fee, which the government thinks should be enough. Whether or not it is a different matter. But that's the way they think. But yeah, get in touch, know your rights, and find out that. I think weigh up the pros and cons if you're being asked to make a change. Don't be fobbed off by thinking, well, I'm a 0 hours contract, I haven't got any rights. You have. You've got employment rights just the same as anyone else. The way you work might impact on those. So if things are based on hourly rates of pay and stuff, it might work out differently for you, but always worth checking.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. If you think you need advice about any of the issues that we've been discussing, you can visit the Citizens Advice website, which has got a wealth of information about various subjects, including the furlough topic that we've been talking about today, but also general employment rights, benefits, entitlements, and anything you can really think of. You can visit citizensadvice.org.uk. If you need advice specifically related to employment, you can also get in touch with ACAS at acas.org.uk. And if you live in North East Derbyshire or Bolsover districts, you can give us a call on 0300 456 8437 or visit our website nedcab.org.uk, and we've got a web chat facility on there if that suits you as well.